I extend a very warm and a heartfelt welcome to you, Professor Santosh Kumar Mehrotra, sir, and all the faculty members, honorable members of the SIRDs, and those who are here with us today. So this particular occasion is here for us to mark the Amrit Swatantrata, 75 years of independence of India. And Swatantrata Amrit Mahotsav is going to be designated by beginning with this event that we have initiated here. Along with the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, which is of course Government of India initiative, we also are celebrating the 40th year of publication of the coveted Journal of Rural Development, which is published from NIRDPR every year as a quarterly. So this journal is indexed in international databases like Scopus, IBISCO, India Citation Index, JGate, Index Copernicus, International, etc. And it is also evaluated by the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences. It is on these two occasions that we have had this good fortune and privilege to invite you, sir, to for the topic. I'll give a brief intro about sir before we proceed. Professor Santosh Kumar Mehrotra is a human development economist. Research and writings have had most influence in the areas of labor, employment, skill development, child poverty, and the economics of education. He brings a combination of professional experience with the Indian government as a policymaker and advisor, with international organization as technical expert, having lived in 3 continents and traveled across 63 countries. His works, in fact, have been translated in Chinese, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and German. Sir has a MA in economics from the New School for Social Research, New School University, New York, and a PhD in economics from Cambridge. And he served with the Jawaharlal Nehru University, after which he went on to join UNICEF and UNDP and returned back to India to head the Rural Development Division in the Planning Commission. So, sir is here with us. Sir is retired professor of economics, Center for Formal Sector and Labor Studies, School of Social Science, ANU, and also visiting professor, Center for Development, University of Bangalore. Sir, I extend a very warm, heartfelt welcome to you. Over to you, Jyotish. Jyotish Satyapalan sir is professor and head at NIRDPR and also heading the School of Professional Support Centers, of which CDC is a part, which is hosting this particular event. I invite Professor Satyapalan to take over and set the oration. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Dr. Akansha, it was a very extensive and very excellent introduction about Professor Santosh Mehrotra. And I don't think the NIRD community or the faculty members or many others join from other professional bodies who need an introduction, a very detailed introduction. But he has extensively contributed to the literature on poverty, employment, growth, and all internationally as well as in Indian case. I think I met him last time when in the CRM, if I remember correctly, he may correct it. I was also part of the CRM of rural development. I got an opportunity that time to discuss with him many issues in the rural development sector. And we all know that the rural transformation and poverty alleviation, employment generation, this all still remain as a major issue even today. And many of the academic and non-academic writings recently appeared in newspapers and down to earth and all. We all read, what he has written and its seriousness about such things. And he is the right person to give us a good lecture or a good, the case about the Indian scenario today. And I hope he agreed to us that he will cover the historical perspective on poverty alleviation, particularly on the estimation side before the COVID period, and what are the challenges we are going to face after this COVID period, particularly while talking on the multidimensional aspects of poverty and measurement. That's a promise he did. I hope let us listen him, and we are really grateful to him for agreeing to this lecture and getting him with a short notice. I asked him, last week, and it's a very short notice we given, and he was very kind enough to agree with this, the NIRD request. We are really thankful to sir, and it's over to Professor Malhotra for the lecture. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, indeed, for inviting me. Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Okay. It's a pleasure to be back to NIRD. I've had a long-standing relationship with the NIRD from even before I became the advisor for rural development in what was then the Planning Commission. And since then, my relationship has survived, and I'm delighted to have been invited again. What I want to do today is to focus on three sets of things, and I will proceed in turn to discuss each one of them. One is the estimates of poverty, past, present, then go on to discuss a related but a separate and independent issue about how we identify the poor, again, past and present. And finally, I will have occasion to discuss programming for the poor as outlined in the MORDs, the Ministry of Rural Development's own programs, and what suggestions or thoughts I might have about that. So let me begin by speaking about estimating the poor. But before I do that, I want to sort of make a few preliminary remarks that India is in a stage of transition, and this is a new India, which I will try and show in a second. But it is still very much an old India. And we'll have occasion to discuss that as well. What do I mean by a new India? You probably, all of you know that since 1992, India has been conducting a nationwide sample survey called the National Family Health Survey. And the last full survey that was done was 2019-20, and the previous, which was NFHS 5, and prior to that was NFHS 4 in 2015-16. And it's I'm going to begin by telling you what is the share of houses with electricity, houses with water inside the house, houses with a television, houses with a fridge. And what's interesting, I'll begin by telling you what the 2015-16 data tells me. And it shows what a new India this has already become by 2015-16. So houses with electricity in India were 88%. Now, obviously, there would be a difference between rural and urban areas, rural being lower. But the fact that, we've come a long way with 88% of all households having electricity. Similarly, households with water inside the house, 67%, which is also very remarkable. In other words, only about a third of households in 15-16 were having to go away to fetch water from a well or a tank or whatever. TVs, houses with TVs. Again, 2/3 of all households, 67%. And what really surprised me, this really surprised me, the TV one. What surprised me was fridges. Refrigerators, 30% of India's households have a fridge, 30%. I'd request everyone to mute themselves, please. What's remarkable is that the recent data, And since all of India's states have not been covered so far, excuse me, can we request everyone to mute themselves, please? Mute their mic. I can hear people who are telling numbers to other people.
Please mute, all mute. I think Hidendra Singh, Mr. Hidendra Singh, would you please mute your system? Also, SIRD Punjab, please mute the system. And Serena, please.
Okay, good. What is remarkable about this New India is that even a state like Bihar, which is one of our poorest, the 2019-20 NFHS 5 tells us that 96% of households in Bihar have electricity. 96%. And 89% in Bihar have water inside the house. 62% have a TV. And 35% have a fridge. So if this is the New India, then we've already seen a remarkable turnaround, as I would imagine that there is a difference between rural and urban, and I'm not going to, go into that. On the one hand, this is the New India. But on the other hand, there is still very much the old India, with still literally hundreds of millions of people who are below the nationally determined poverty line, the Tendulkar poverty line, which is what I'm going to use in my analysis in a minute. And in fact, the NFHS 5, the latest 1920, says that compared to 2015-16, stunting of children and undernutrition of children between 2015 and 2020 has barely improved. We also know that, and we see evidence all around us, that on top of high levels of poverty and malnutrition in our population, our inequality is rising and has been rising rather sharply in the past few years. So with this background, and we must never forget that we have the largest number of poor people in terms of absolute poverty in the world, of any country in the world. We have nearly as many poor people in our country as much of sub-Saharan Africa taken together. So we should always be cognizant of this.
Audio is not audible.
Sorry, I'm not audible? Is it true I'm not audible?
Yes, audible here.
You are audible.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So let me turn to what was the headcount ratio of the poor, meaning what was the incidence of poverty or the share of the population below the poverty line in 2004-5, and what has happened since then. 36.7% of the people were below the poverty line, the Tendulkar poverty line in 2004-5. That fell sharply to 22.6%. That's in 2011-12. That's a remarkable decline of nearly 14 percentage points over that 7-year period when we experienced quite unprecedented growth. Now, since 2011-12, unfortunately, we haven't had a consumption expenditure survey. The one which was done in 17-18, that data was not released. It is now to be new consumption expenditure surveys to be done. But it's perfectly still possible to estimate the number of the poor based on what is called the periodic labor force survey, which it also collects data about consumption expenditure. And we have the latest consumption expenditure from the PLFS collected by the NSO across the whole country. And my estimate of the absolute of the incidence of poverty is that between 2012 and 2018, it shot up from 22.6% to 28.4%. It has increased since then in 2018-19, which is the latest data available, to about 33%. In other words, we are moving backwards as the data would suggest, and I will try and explain to you what is happening and why this is happening. Because in 2004-5, the absolute number of the poor in our country was about 402 million, which had fallen by almost 140 million by 2012 to 277 million. Tendulkar poverty line. Unfortunately, that number has risen, my estimates are, from 277 to 344 million. And further, in 2018-19 to 436 million, which is the number of the poor, where the number of the poor is actually larger than we had in 2004-5. Now, I want you to appreciate and understand why poverty fell at an unprecedented rate until 2012, especially between 2004-5 and 12. You see, if you look at the dynamic pre-2004 of poverty and the headcount ratio of poverty and the absolute number of the poor, what you'll find is the following. And I should tell you that I wrote the chapter for the 11th five-year plan 2007 to 12 on rural poverty and rural development, because I was then the head of the Rural Development Division in the Planning Commission. And I had the occasion to analyze this from 1973-74 all the way to 2004-5, which was the last point for which we had data when we were writing the 11th five-year plan in 2007. And what shocked me was that while the incidence of poverty had been declining, meaning the share of the population below the poverty line had been falling, the absolute number of the poor had not fallen. So the absolute number of the poor was 320 million. Jain Saab, could you please mute yourself? Ramesh Jain, please. What is remarkable is that, you know, we had 320 million poor by the Lakdawala poverty line, which was the earlier poverty line. 320 million poor in 73-4. In 83-4, we had the same number. In 93-4, we had the same number of poor of 320 million poor. And by 2004, the number had dropped merely to 302 million poor people by the Lakdawala poverty line. This is not surprising, because while growth had picked up post 1980, it was nowhere close to the kind of rate that we experienced post 2003-4. And job growth in the non-farm sector had been relatively slow until 2004-5. So while the population had been growing, it's true that it is you can call this an achievement that the absolute number of the poor was not increasing. But the fact of the matter is that for 30 years, the absolute number of the poor in our country was stagnant. And this dynamic changed very dramatically after 2004-5. And the numbers bear this out. From 2004-5 to 2012, the growth in the non-farm jobs sector, the growth was remarkable. We were adding 7.5 million new non-farm jobs post 2004-5 every year, when we were adding a very small number of people to the labor force, as a result of which millions were pulled out of agriculture. You see, it's interesting that it would interest you to know that Since independence till 2004-5, the absolute number of workers in agriculture had actually been increasing, every year since independence to 2004-5. Also, although the share of workers of the total workforce working in agriculture had been falling, but it was falling so slowly, and non-farm jobs were growing so slowly, that the absolute number of workers in agriculture was growing till 2004. So plot sizes were shrinking, rural distress was growing, rural incomes were falling, and hence you shouldn't be surprised that the absolute number of the poor was not falling until 2004-5. However, that changed dramatically post 4-5 because the non-farm job growth shot up so much that workers were pulled out of agriculture at a rate of 5 million per annum. This was unprecedented in India's history. And because workers were pulled out of agriculture, the labor market in agriculture in rural areas tightened, real wages increased, and as real wages increased and Manrega was also introduced in beginning of 2005, a subject I'll come back to shortly, you got a rise in real wages as non-farm jobs pulled workers away from agriculture. And wages increased, as a result of which consumption expenditure increased. And as consumption expenditure increases, poverty declines. This was the dynamic. Now, this dynamic certainly continued until 2012. Unfortunately, the NSO data tells us that post 2013, all the way until 2018-19, the NSO data, the Periodic Labor Force Survey data, tells us, and I've done detailed analysis, and some of you may have seen my published work in this, which is available. If you're interested, I can share it with Professor Satyapalan, and he can share it with you, that the rate of non-farm growth fell from the 7.5 million new non-farm jobs until 12 to under 3 million per annum after 12. This is not so surprising because the growth rate tended to fall off compared to the 8% per annum average that our GDP grew at between 2004 and 14. Now, the result of new non-farm jobs growing slower, while at the same time young people entering the labor force was increasing, resulted in growing unemployment, open unemployment, because you had better and better young educated people entering the labor force, looking for non-farm jobs in urban areas, in industry and services, and not finding them because the economy was not growing fast enough. The result was that by 2019, we had a 45-year high in the open unemployment rate. A 45-year high in the open unemployment rate, and youth unemployment tripled from what was 6% in 2012 to 18% in the year 2018. This was the driving reason behind the rise in the numbers of the poor and the incidence of poverty that I was just talking about. You recall I was saying that the incidence of poverty increased from 22.6% in 2012 to 28.4%. Dr. Satyapalan, could you request everyone to mute themselves, or you could just mute them. Just mute everyone. Because I keep getting these sort of...
Dr. Akansha, can we mute centrally this? Just try to centrally mute everyone, and then Professor Malhotra only will unmute it. You are the host, you may be able to do that.
Just give a right click and mute all.
Yeah. So please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Now, so this was the situation in early 2020 when COVID came. Now, when COVID came, there was a massive national strict lockdown at very, very short notice, which lasted till the end of May, and then we started unlocking slowly from the beginning of June and so on. Everyone knows the story of the reverse migration that took place. And this reverse migration reversed also the phenomenon that I was describing that was taking place for the preceding 15 years from 2004-5 onwards, where the absolute number of workers in agriculture had been dropping. What reverse migration did was to return millions of people back to agriculture. So if you look at the latest PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey of the NSO for 2019-20, which I should tell you, we were discussing in the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics of the Ministry of Statistics, of which I am a member. Just this morning, this data is still to be released. It is about to be released. And what we discover is that the share of agriculture in total workforce increased. I won't tell you the exact numbers in 2019-20 because of the reverse migration. In other words, what you get is the opposite of what we were seeing for the preceding 15 years. In other words, you go back to a trend which I was telling you about that prevailed for 50 years from independence to 2004-5, where the absolute number of workers in agriculture was growing. Why is this such a bad thing? It's a bad thing because structural transformation in a developing country like ours means the following. Structural transformation essentially means two things. One, that the share of agriculture in total output and total GDP declines, as it has been declining. It's fallen to 14 to 15%. And simultaneously, the share of agriculture in total employment. And it falls as it has been falling consistently and very rapidly post 2004-5, all the way until 2017-18 and 2018-19, I would, sorry, 2018-19. And then suddenly we get COVID and the reverse migration takes place and millions go back to agriculture out of desperation, out of joblessness. So we get a reversal of the process of structural transformation that had gathered momentum, particularly post 2004, especially until 2012, which had slowed down until 2019, but it was still proceeding gradually. What you get as a result of COVID is a complete reversal with workers going back to agriculture, with millions getting added to agriculture. The meaning of that is the following. Agriculture already has surplus labor. Millions want to leave agriculture. The young people, as I will return to shortly, the young people don't want to be in agriculture. They've gotten better educated. They all want urban jobs in industry and in services. Their parents don't want to do farming. NSO data says so. And yet they were forced back on account of a stringent national sudden lockdown, which destroyed millions of livelihoods in the urban areas. This is the crisis that is facing us, that has resulted in the increase in the absolute number of the poor that we are going to see even further. I'm in the process of estimating the numbers of the poor and the incidence of poverty on the basis of more recent data using CMIE data, and I will release that and publish that shortly. But what you will find is that while 2019 had already seen an increase not only in the headcount ratio of poor, the incidence of poverty, but also the absolute number of poor, what we are going to see is an even further increase in the numbers of the poor. So, you know, the old India that I began by talking about is returning. It is the opposite of what we want to see in our wonderful country. Now, enough said about estimating the poor. I'm going to move to the second part of my discussion, which is about identifying the poor. Now, as people who work in SIRDs and in IRD, you are obviously familiar with the MORD censuses that began in 1992 to identify the quote-unquote poor who would be the beneficiaries of government programs, including but not only MORD programs. And many state governments have used the identification of the poor, the so-called BPL category, that the MORD censuses have conducted. Now, MORD census was first conducted in 1992. Next, 5 years later, was 1997. The third next was in 2002. And each of them had used slightly different methods, not slightly, actually quite radically different methods. The first one had used income, identifying the incomes of households. Now, you know that India's workforce works in the informal sector. Employers don't know where their work, who their workers are. Sorry, other than the employers, no one else knows who their workers are. They are not registered anywhere. So incomes are mostly informal. You would probably have heard the statistic in India, 91% of our workforce has no social security. You are among the 9% who are quite privileged in having long-term contracts and also have social security at the end of your working life when you retire. But 91% of our people do not have that. This is the meaning of informality. But so to try and identify poor people by measuring their income was a very poor method. So what resulted in identifying so-called BPL according to the income method between 1992 and 1996, which was extremely flawed. In 1997, that was changed to looking at consumption. That didn't work very well either. And you actually deepened the exclusion errors and the inclusion errors in the identification of the poor. What do I mean by exclusion errors? Those who were really poor got left out because of the method that was being used. Those who were not poor often got included. So inclusion errors and exclusion errors both occurred. So you got an even more distorted list of beneficiaries called BPL. This method was changed again in the 2002 census conducted by MORD, of which all of you are a part, which used 13 questions to supposedly identify the poor. All this history is actually analyzed in a chapter in one of my books. Cambridge University Press published a book of mine called Seizing the Demographic Dividend, which I hope NIRD has in its library, and maybe SIRDs should also procure one. There are many other chapters in the book which would be of value and of interest for you. And all the problems with the 92, 97, and 2002 methods of identifying the poor are laid out there. As a result of the massive inclusion and exclusion errors that continued as a result of the third census of 2002, the government of India decided to constitute a new committee in 2006. That was precisely the time when I had joined as the Rural Development Advisor in the Planning Commission. This committee was called the NC Saxena Committee. NC Saxena used to be Secretary Rural Development long ago and had retired as Secretary of the Planning Commission. And I happened to be the member secretary of this NC Saxena committee. And we were now to arrive at a new design for the census that the MORD is supposed to carry out every 5 years. I wrote a paper along with a colleague, which was published in Economic and Political Weekly in 2008. And that became the basis for the design of the next census. What is the next census called? All of you know it as SECC, the Socio-Economic and Caste Census. It was based on the NC Saxena Committee report, for which I was part of the drafting committee. Now, let me, for those of you who may or may not be too familiar with what the design of the SECC is, let me lay that out for you, because it's very important for you to understand how and why the design of the SECC is not just superior, but far superior to any of the 3 censuses that the MORD had carried out across the whole country. You see, what the SECC does, I mean, I will critique the SECC also in a minute, because that's in some ways one of my objectives in this lecture, to talk to you about what now needs to be done. What has already been done is done, but we need to first understand what was the nature of the SECC. What we proceeded to do in designing the architecture of what the next census that MORD was to carry out post 2008 was as follows. We felt that one of the biggest problems with the misidentification of the poor, misidentification meaning those who should be targeted should in fact be in the list but get left out, and those who should not be beneficiaries should surely be left out of the list. And we had to derive or devise a method which would ensure this in a transparent, objective manner. So what we went about doing was the following. We decided to use 3 categories to try and determine which households belong to one of 3 categories. What were the 3 categories? And you will see that these categories had indicators which were verifiable, which were observable. In other words, the parameters of exclusion and of inclusion were very clear, unlike that was the case with 92, 97, and 2002 censuses. So the 3 categories of households were those who were totally excluded from the list. I'll come to that in a minute. The second category was those who were automatically included in the list of possible beneficiaries. And the third category consisted of those who would be considered as deprived based on fulfilling any one of 7 deprivation indicators. So let me described to you the first category, which is total house excluded households, were based on fulfilling any of the following parameters. And there are 14 of them. I'm not going to read them out, all of them, but I'll give you a sense of how, reasonably easily identifiable these households could be. These would be households which will not be part of the so-called BPL or deprived. One, those who had a motorized 2 or 3 or 4-wheeler fishing boat, or two or three or 4-wheeler, meaning car or motorcycle, or a fishing boat. Second, we had to exclude those who had 3 or 4-wheeler agricultural equipment, meaning those who own tractors. Or we excluded those where a household member was a government employee. We excluded those who were paying income tax. We excluded those whose households were earning more than rupees 10,000 per month, and so on and so on. Now, this is, I won't go into detail because it will take up too much time. You can read about all this, as I'm saying, from that paper of mine. Next, what kind of households would be automatically included? Now, I'll read out all 5 parameters of inclusion. 1, households without shelter. Second, destitute, living on alms. In other words, living on donations from a trust or a mandir or other people. Third, manual scavenger families. Fourth, primitive tribal groups. And finally, legally released bonded labor. These would be automatically included. So after you include some automatically at the bottom of the pyramid, social and income pyramid, and after you exclude those who are much better off, you still have the bulk of the population. Now, how do you identify them? Because that's where the biggest problems were arising with the previous censuses. And we arrived at 7 parameters or indicators of deprivation, and notice that almost all of them are directly verifiable, directly observable. तो मतलब it will not be possible कि आप अपने local सरपंच या MLA या MP के पास जा करके अपना नाम BPL में लिखवा लें, because there would be obviously question marks. So, what were the 7 parameters? 1, households with 1 or less room, kacha walls and kacha roof. Another, no adult member in the household between ages 18 and 59. In other words, it's a child-headed household, under 18. Third, female-headed household with no adult male member between 16 and 59. Female-headed households. आदमी भाग गया, चाहे डिवोर्स किया या न किया, उसका देहांत हो गया. Fourth, households with disabled member, differently abled member with no other able-bodied adult member. Disabled. Fifth, SC household or ST household. 6, households with no literate adult above age 25 years. And 7th, landless households deriving a major part of their income from manual labor. So every household could be identified by using these deprivations. And if you look at the SECC data, you go to the SECC data of any village, and it's all up on the website of the MORD. You can go to a household and you can see what deprivations that household suffers from. Some households may well suffer from 1 or more than 1 deprivation. Some could suffer from all 7. So that gave you a sense of the scale of the problem. Now, all this is very good. This has worked rather well. But there were two things that we had recommended in our committee report, which unfortunately MORD never implemented. And I would strongly urge the NIRD to urge the MORD that in the next round of the SECC, which should use pretty much the same design, so you don't get massive increases and or declines in the absolute number of the identified deprived. You continue to use the current design, but there are two things which we had recommended should have been done, which were not done, and they must be done now. Firstly, it has always been the practice and that this census was to be done every 5 years, because the old India is also changing. I have just demonstrated to you at the beginning that there are households which are changing. So for instance, just now I mentioned one of the 7 deprivations was households with 1 or less room, kacha wall and kacha roof. Now the point is PMAY, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, and before that the Indira Awas Yojana had been providing households to poor people. Now the numbers of PMAY beneficiary households has increased very dramatically. Now, if you don't take them out of the list because they are not suffering any longer from this deprivation, then you are doing injustice to many other people, because the state has only limited resources. It can benefit only so many people. Similarly, you know, the 6th deprivation, households with no literate adult above age 25 years. You know, in the last 15 years, there's been a dramatic increase in the enrollment rate in schools, in higher secondary as well. Dramatic, so dramatic that between 2010 and 2015, the share of the 15 to 16-year-olds who were in secondary school, classes 9 and 10, shot up from 58% in 2010 to 85% in 2015. That's a remarkable turnaround. So clearly people are falling out of these deprivations as well. Households are dropping out. All this needs to have been recorded in a survey or census, which should have been completed latest by, I would say, because I think the SECC began in 2011, and if I'm not wrong, it was already complete by 2013. All lists were made public by the end of 2013. It had begun to be used by then. That means 5 years later, by 2018, the MORD census, SECC, should have been done again. But 3 years have passed since 2018 and this has not been done. This is not acceptable any longer. This is problem number 1. Problem number 2. We had also recommended that there should be an updating and a ground truthing of the list of beneficiaries every 2 years, which should be done at the Gram Panchayat level by the Gram Sabha meeting and looking at the actual profile of individual households, going household by deprivation, and either weeding them out, weeding those who are already beneficiaries, or including those who had been left out. Do you see what I'm trying to say? The ground truthing should have been done every 2 years. That has also not been done. And this is the source of massive problems. And as Dr. Satyapalan said, he and I have been, members of the Common Review Mission of the MORD to look at the programming of MORD programs. I led the team for UP in, I think, 2017 or 2018. And before that, I had led the team for Chhattisgarh. And we were appalled to see that there was great distress in rural areas where people were saying to us that we are not being counted, and here is a disabled person, here is a female headed household. And you see what I'm saying? This is not acceptable. Not only has a new SECC to be done immediately, but it has to be ground truth after the census data is available. And in fact, it shouldn't be, the data should not be made public until the ground truthing first takes place at the panchayat, at the Gram Sabha level. It must do that. It's critical. Huh? In other words, a new census cannot happen 2 or 3 years from now. We are already delayed by 3 years. And I would suggest to the MORD, like the NSO, which now collects data on employment, unemployment, and other indicators on a tablet. And like the CMIE based out of Mumbai, which collects a panel data for a sample size bigger than the NSO, data must be collected on a tablet. The enumerators must collect this data on a tablet so that the turnaround time is not 2 years, 2.5 years, as happened with the previous one. You can't do it on paper any longer, because you do it on paper, then it has to be entered, then it has to be cleaned, it has to be, etc., etc. The data turnaround has to be extremely fast, very critical. Anyway, it's therefore absolutely critical that we do this in quickly on a tablet and do ground truthing as quickly as possible, and then do the ground truthing and revision of the lists at the village level every 2 years until the next 5-year census comes around. Enough said about identifying the poor. Let me turn to the third part of my lecture. I'm sorry I'm taking a bit longer, but I'm sort of having to explain a lot of things which I was hoping not to have to explain. But let me turn to programming for the poor. And I will in turn discuss a series of programs that the MRD is justifiably famous for: Manrega, NRLM, NSAP, PMAY, and DDU-GKY. But before I deal with each one of these, I want to say the following, which applies to all of them. If we want to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of our anti-poverty interventions, we have to take democratic decentralization as enabled by the 1992-93 constitutional amendments truly seriously. Truly seriously in the same way as the Kerala government has done, a subject I'll come back to in a minute. But before I go, you have to appreciate that we are a highly centralized form of government. And I'm not talking about the recent developments. I'm talking about the entire period all the way from independence to 1992 until the constitutional amendment came. And unfortunately, even the constitutional amendment has not been implemented in the way it should have. For instance, the constitutional amendments asked for 29 subjects to be transferred to the PRIs. Has NIRD done a study of how many state governments have actually transferred all 29 subjects which were required by the Indian Constitution? If you were to do that, unless you've already done it, you would probably find that a very large number of them have not transferred all 29. The constitutional amendment requires the following 3 things from the state governments that the PRIs will receive all three Fs, the funds, the functions, and the functionaries will all be transferred for these 29 subjects to the PRIs. Among them are, of course, health, education, water and sanitation, etc., etc. And it will be worth listening to you if you know whether all 29 have been transferred. Why is this important? Because if you want serious accountability, if you want less corruption, if you want improved effectiveness of MORD programs and all programs, why just MORD? Deep democratic decentralization is absolutely essential. It would interest you to know the following. The contrast between India and China is very telling. You all know that China is a one-party state. We are the democracy, the electoral democracy, multi-party electoral democracy. One big difference. Second big difference, they have a unitary constitution, although they have 30 provinces across the whole country. I hope you know the difference between a unitary constitution and a federal constitution, and ours is a federation. We are a federal democracy. The third difference, and this is what is very important, that although they are the one-party state, they are the unitary they have the unitary constitution. We are the multi-party democracy. We are the federation. They have a much more fiscally decentralized system of government and governance than we do. We have a more fiscally centralized system of governance. This should shock you, and it's very painful that this is the case. Local governments there are extremely powerful, more powerful than the provincial government. In our country, it's the opposite. It would interest you to know that 54% of all public expenditure undertaken by any level of government in China, by all levels of government, local, provincial, and central, 54% is undertaken by local governments, by the equivalent of what in our country would be called urban local bodies and PRIs. What is the share in India? 5%. 54 versus 5. In China, 23% of all taxes that are collected by all levels of government, Beijing, provincial governments, local governments, all taken together, 23% of them are collected by local governments in China. You know what the share in India is? 1%. That's how weak our local governments are, despite the constitutional amendments of nearly 30 years ago. This is yet another evidence of what I was talking about earlier about the fact that the 29 subjects have not been transferred. If you want less corruption, you want more effectiveness of your programs, governments have to become serious about going the Kerala, the Chinese way. There is no alternative. Let me move very quickly to the programming for the poor. I'm going on a little longer than I was hoping. I'll go through this very fast. What should change with Manrega, with COVID, and with the new India, the changing India? One, it's absolutely critical that the notion of synergy and the notion of convergence of Manrega with other programs becomes very serious. I think all of you know that in the 15 years that Manrega has been in existence, it has done good work in water conservation and land conservation. However, the crisis, the water crisis and groundwater crisis has become only worse over a period of time. There is no more time to waste any longer. All of you are probably familiar with the notion of watershed. A watershed consists of an area of 500 hectares, of which water-related planning is done for the entire 500-hectare area. There has been historically a reasonably successful watershed development program in MORD, part of the Land Resources Department of the MORD. It is absolutely critical that Manrega and watershed management needs to become much more convergent, because you need to use the watershed notion of a watershed in wherever it is possible to do that. But there is a new dimension. Everyone knows about JJM, the Jal Jeevan Mission, the newest focus of the government. And the allocation for JJM is now very significant. For instance, I learned the other day that UP had received last year an allocation under JJM of 3,000 crores, of which they used only 40%. This year, their allocation has been increased to 10,000 crores under JJM. JJM, if you read the guidelines, as I have, you will discover that it is a rather well-conceived, holistic program. It has a holistic vision of looking at water use in agriculture, water use in industry, not just Nal Se Jal, meaning not just piped water to household. I already showed the data to you that the majority of Indian households, even in poor states, have already a tap, water in the household. The real crisis in the country relates to the falling water tables, excessive extraction of water for purposes of agriculture. 80 in our country, 80% of all water that is in use in India goes for agriculture, freshwater use. That is much higher than is the case in other developing countries. We must reduce the use of water for irrigation and for agriculture by adopting much more sprinkler and drip technology. Perhaps Manrega can come in here, but equally importantly, watershed management needs to be taken seriously along with Manrega, and the focus of JGM cannot be just Nal Se Jal in the household. A second priority could very well be that beyond the 100 days, in the post-COVID period, there might be households in every district and villages where they have already reached 100% days. Poverty is increasing. I was saying to you, reverse migration has happened. Millions have returned to their farms. And last year's data told us, Manrega website data, I'm citing Manrega website data. I remember data from July, August, that 80 million person days of work was demanded, but only 62 million person days was provided. That means about 20% of households did not receive the work that they were demanding. When poverty was increasing, this is tragic. We need to consider the possibility of extra days if we want this poverty not to go on. Thirdly, we are all aware of the delays in wage payment. This has been a historical problem with Manrega. It remains a continuing problem. Fourth and finally, in respect of Manrega, again, going back to the notion of synergy and convergence, COVID is a health crisis. Many of you would know that testing in rural areas for COVID, whether it's for the rapid antigen test or the RT-PCR test, has been relatively minimal, particularly in the northern and eastern states. And a very important reason for that is there aren't enough sub-centers. There is a serious shortage of sub-centers and of PHCs across the country. Manrega labor could be used for building these sub-centers. In other words, I would say the priority at this juncture should be reviving our health, public health infrastructure, rather than leaving people to the private sector or the quacks or the jholawala doctors. What this means is that you may have to divert funds away from PMAY, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which has been receiving massive doses of funding in the 3 years preceding 2019. Let me turn to NRLM very quickly. Very quickly. NRLM is of recent vintage. It came into existence only in about 2011. Prior to that, since, if I remember correctly, 99, there was the SJSY, the Sampurna Grami Swarozgar Yojana. When I joined the Planning Commission, I was head of the Rural Development Division. It was the SJSY, not the NRLM. A committee was constituted by the MORD. I happened to be a member of it. It was chaired by Dr. Radhakrishna. And I'm delighted to say that the NRLM that you know today is the outcome of the suggestions of that committee. And I'm very proud to say that I was part of that process, because we had learned the lessons of the Andhra success model, the IKP, and of the Kudumbashree of Kerala, and that those principles were applied to the NRLM. Now, I want to make 3 points about the NRLM in the current phase of our development. One, all of you must be familiar with the following fact, that joblessness, of course, has increased for men, but it has increased even more for women. It's not just that women are looking for work and not finding it, but women have stopped looking for work, having gotten so disappointed because their own men and brothers have not found work. So there is the phenomenon of the falling female labor force participation rate. Now, I distinguish this fall in the female participation rate in 2 ways. One, you have to look at older, poorly educated women who mostly worked in agriculture. Now, what has happened in the new India, which I was talking about, is that farming has become much more mechanized. Because farming is becoming more mechanized, and those activities where women were engaged in threshing, in winnowing, those particular activities have gotten more mechanized. So women have fallen out of work. The older, poorly educated women, now they used to work on the family farm. They have precious little to do because they are so poorly educated, they cannot do other things. What can they do? They can join SHGs. That's why the improved allocation for NRLM in the last year's budget, in this year's budget, is very good news. I was very pleased to see that. However, there are at least a couple of other things that I want to point out about NRLM. The lessons from the Andhra success story, the Kudumbashree success story, haven't sufficiently well been internalized by NRLM across the whole country, and it's absolutely critical that that happens. What were the lessons? 2 lessons in particular that jumped out at us when we were examining, for the purposes of our committee 10 years ago, the experience of Andhra and of Kerala. One was federations of SHGs. In other words, federations of SHGs which go all the way up to the state level, which are extremely important, strengthening institutional development that needs to happen in every state. 1. 2, The success story of both Kudumshri and Andhra was built upon creating institutions at the state level, which were sort of connected to the government, but still separate from the government. Institutions which provided hand-holding to the SHGs, hand-holding by professionals, not by bureaucrats, but by professionals who had worked in the field, who could have run NGOs or who were part of NGOs. Because poorly educated women who had always worked in agriculture don't know how to run a business. That's what SHGs are attempting to do in the non-farm sector. They need hand-holding to approach the banks, to formulate projects. Other than that, been running the projects, whatever they might be attempting to do, that institutional development, I don't believe has happened in a strong enough way. And finally, in respect of NRLM, I want to cite the example of how women's participation in Kerala in the MGNREGA has also helped improve the functioning of the SHG movement there. It would interest you to know that, I'm sure you know this, that women's participation in Manrega is about 53% on average in the country. Only 47% of men are workers in Manrega. But in Kerala, 91% of the workers in agriculture are women. You see, Manrega wages in Kerala are lower than open market wages because it's a relatively high wage economy. So it's women who tend to work there. But what is important here is that women SHGs play a role in the implementation of Manrega in Kerala. And secondly, what is important is that these women SHGs from the Kudumbashri have, actually converged the SHG with the panchayat's functioning. And that's very important. So in other words, ultimately it then comes back again to the decentralized, implementation of all programs. Let me turn very quickly and briefly to NSAP, the old age pension. 2 points very briefly, which must change. One, the amount of the pension. I think the amount of the pension is still pretty much what it used to be some 15 years ago. It's pathetic. It needs to be increased, particularly at a time of COVID crisis when poverty is increasing, especially in rural areas. Point one. Point two, the identification of the beneficiaries, unfortunately, still is on the basis of the 2002 MORD census. Believe it or not, this is shocking. SECC has been done. Why are you still identifying beneficiaries on the basis of the 2002 flawed census? Flawed, I have proven to you. Stop this. This is wrong. The identification should have changed long back. You have an SECC in place, use that. Let me quickly move on to PMAY. Already it has done rather well. Reduce allocations. The fiscal constraints of the central government are very severe post-COVID. You cannot go on building these households. Other programs need more funds, quite apart from infrastructure, quite apart from health, quite apart from education, which have been underfunded, quite apart from these other programs that I've been making an argument for. You cannot spend everywhere and more everywhere. So reduce allocations on PMAY to release resources. TDU-GKY, two sets of problems. One, most of the training, despite recent changes when Amarjit Sinha was the MORD secretary, was still short-term training. Like most of the training carried out by NSDC-funded vocational training providers, the DDU-GKY also provides mostly short-term training. Please understand Short-term training will not enable these young people who are getting trained to get formal sector jobs. These young people have gotten certificates of secondary or whatever, or class A, but they are very poorly educated. They are half educated. You cannot provide half educated young people with quarter skilling, because to provide genuine vocational skills, you need at least a year. Short-term training does not do it for you, just as NSDC does not do it for NSDC vocational training providers does not do it for you. Second, on DDUGK. These centers, the DDUGKY centers, need placement counseling for their trainees. They need local private sector involvement. In other words, there's a need to link to local industry and service sector requirements in the district where these centers are located. Don't think there has been enough focus on that. With that, I will conclude. I'm sorry I've gone on for longer than I had intended. Please remember, COVID is a once-in-a-century pandemic. Lives and livelihoods both have been impacted in a way that is unprecedented in the history of our country. I was pleased finally that in the most recent stimulus of 2 days ago, the finance minister announced 23,000 crore allocation for health, for strengthening the public health infrastructure, although it's mainly for pediatric care. Unfortunately, this is too little, too late. You know, the government, center and states taken together spend only 1.29% of GDP on health. Poorer countries spend a higher proportion of GDP, government spends higher proportion. This 23,000 crores only adds another 0.12%. Please remember that the National Health Policy of 2017 promised that we are going to increase public allocation for health to 2.5% of GDP, in other words, doubling it. It's critical that there is a convergence between government programs, MORD programs, and these new infrastructure that might be created as a result of these new allocations, the limited allocations that have so far taken place. Therefore, think very carefully about what I've been suggesting. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. This is the most riveting, enlightening, and not only your passion comes across very strongly as you spoke, but I could actually connect with all the gaps that you have pointed out. Although we are short on time, and I understand that you are preoccupied, but sir, there are certain questions on the chat box which have been raised by our patient listeners. More than 62 people had been a part of this. I would request you to just look at the chat box. One of the questions talks about the ICDS and why it has not been able to do well. The other talks about something of linking of rivers through Manrega, whether that would be a good idea. So your parting words on these questions, sir, which were there in the chat box.
Give me a second. I'm going to share some numbers on ICDS with you.
Right.
I was the one who wrote the chapter on ICDS in the 11th five-year plan, and I've followed that program since then. Okay. ICDS is perhaps one program which I assume you know is supposed to address both under 3-year-olds as well as 3 to 6-year-olds who are the relevant target group for the very high malnutrition that our children suffer. Malnutrition in our country, child malnutrition is higher than in Africa. Therefore, the importance of ICDS cannot be understated. But look at the allocation of ICDS between 2014-15 and 2021. And you would be shocked to know that over this period, it has barely risen by 7% in nominal terms. That means it has actually fallen in real terms, because every year the inflation rate is of the order of 5 to 6%. I'm saying it was over a 7-year period, it has increased by only 7%. It was ICDS allocation was 16,562 crores in 14-15, and the budget allocation for 2021 was 20,500 crores. Last year, in 1920, it was only 17,000 crores. So that is how much priority ICDS has been given, and you can imagine how it might have been treated in this year. And unfortunately, and I closed with this, and I'm going to drive my point home by telling you that the center's health budget has been pretty much stagnant between 2017-18 and 2020-21. And you would have expected that the health budget would have increased in 2020-2021, meaning FY21. Well, other than the 15,000 crores in the Atmanirbhar Bharat, which was meant for temporary new centers, for COVID centers that being created, or buying PPEs or masks, etc., nothing allocated in that in 2020-21. In 21-22 budget, the newspapers were trumpeting that there was a 137% increase in to health. 3 months ago in the health budget. Not true at all. If you take away the expenditure on COVID vaccine, and surely the government has to vaccinate our people, I don't think it should be included really. The normal expenditure on health by the central government has, in real terms, actually fallen in nominal terms between 2021 and 21-22. The budgeted. It was a shock when we saw this. And to make it seem that there was a 137% increase, all these, the COVID vaccine allocation was added, and what was added was water and sanitation. Now, water and sanitation already has a separate line item in the budget. Why are we adding water and sanitation for the first time in the FM speech? What is the meaning of this? So, we have to take seriously what has to be taken seriously in a once-in-a-century pandemic. There was another question. What is the second question, Kansha?
So one question relates to why we cannot link. How would it be if we can link the rivers under Manrega?
Yes.
Yeah.
Linking rivers was attempted and done in China with some pretty catastrophic consequences. Point one. Point two, it's a very capital intensive business. It will take up a lot of money, which we can scarce, allocate today. That's why I talked about watershed management. That's why I talked about synergy, utilizing better what you are allocating to recharge waters. Land reclamation and water conservation to refill the aquifers under the ground. These are features these are policies that have to be adopted on a crash basis. And the misutilization of water for agriculture. Why are we still reliant upon canal irrigation? A few years ago, I was flying over Brazil. Brazil has a lot of land and a lot of water. and it has a population smaller than UP, but it's a country larger than ours. And you know what? Everywhere I could see sprinklers. Everywhere I saw sprinklers irrigating the crop. And everywhere one could see, well, I was told about drip irrigation. Why is there no subsidy for drip irrigation and sprinkler systems which conserve water? And why are we growing rice in Vidarbha in Maharashtra, which is water guzzling paddy, and water guzzling paddy in Punjab, where electricity is free and diesel is very cheap, allowing water to be pumped out? This is absurd policy making. We are misutilizing our water resources for agriculture. We cannot afford to do this. We have to fix these problems before we think about, grand schemes about linking rivers. Next.
Any other? So Dr. Sahu wanted to ask one question actually. So with that question, we can conclude this. Yes.
Can I ask, sir?
Yes, PP Sahu.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. It was a wonderful exposition on poverty. You did talk about statistical institutions, but I want to hear from you again the kind of existing statistical apparatus that we have, which do not match the requirement of 21st century. The second, our understanding on poverty is largely we understand poverty largely as a stock concept rather than as a flow concept, and we have absolutely no clue how, why, and under what condition a family escapes from poverty or fall below the poverty. And third, most of our anti-poverty policies are standardized national policy which do not match with the local or ground reality. So I just want to hear from you on this observation. And last, what is your take on new poverty or COVID induced poverty? What new parameters we have to think of to capture, measure, and design scheme for new poverty because of poverty, COVID pandemic? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. On the statistical system, I think I made some remarks about how MORD should go about collecting new data in the new census that needs to be done. This is tablet-based technology is what is being used by a National Sample Survey Organization. But you are asking a larger question about the statistical system, and I should say the following. Please remember that our NSO is a very robust organization which has been in existence since early 1950s. B.C. Mahalanobis, who was the man who was responsible for the second five-year plan of India, and who was himself, by the way, a physicist, but essentially became a statistician, but helped to create the ISI and helped to create the NSSO. And the systems of NSSO have evolved, learning from international sources, but also learning from its own experiences. And it's certainly a very robust institution with a large network across the country, which has been providing technical support to many other developing countries. Having said that, there are still a few remaining problems. One, it is still underfunded. Let me give you some examples of the underfunding, which I know personally about because been for the last 1.5 years a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics, and I mentioned some of the issues there. This country is in the middle of its demographic dividend. Millions of young people are joining the labor force every year, better educated, looking for work. But till 17-18, we were not collecting and publishing data on employment on a regular annual basis. We would collect data only every 5 years. Thankfully, it has become annual, and the turnaround time of the making the data public once it's collected has become faster. Having said that, unfortunately, the NSO was not well prepared for doing this on a regular basis. It's not just that we are now doing an annual survey for employment. We are also doing an annual survey for unorganized enterprises in our country. Please understand that 97% of all enterprises in our country, across the whole country, non-farm enterprises, are unorganized sector enterprises. And we used to do surveys only once in 5 years. One was 2010-11, next was 2015-16. Since then, the next one was done in 1920, and that has still not been made public. I'm also a member of that subcommittee. Thankfully, it's going to be done annually. So the quality of our GDP data will improve, because so far we collect GDP for unorganized sector enterprises by projecting for the same sector organized units performance onto the unorganized sector in that sector. That's not a very robust method of generating GDPs. Thankfully, once we have this annual unorganized sector enterprise survey, we will have much better data. But all this means more funding. It needs, why? Because you need human resources. You need warm bodies in the relevant positions. You'd be interested to know that along with the employment survey, which is done once in a year, it was also decided 3-4 years ago that we will publish, like most other major economies do, quarterly surveys of employment. So a subsample of the national sample, the urban sample, was chosen, for which quarterly data would become available. However, what is the last quarter for which we have data in the public domain? Believe it or not, it is March to June 2020. We are at the end of June 21. What is the purpose of a quarterly survey? COVID has come, 2 waves have come and gone. You would want to know what the hell has been happening. But the only source of quality data on this is the CMIE. This is not good enough. I could go on, but I won't. You can understand where I'm headed. There's the notion of stock and flow and poverty. I think, let me answer your question by looking at both the estimates of poverty as well as the identification of poverty. On the estimates of poverty, if you see, in our country, because we are a highly informalized economy, we cannot use, I said this earlier, income as a basis of estimating poverty. We use consumption expenditure. And we've done, the NSO has been doing every 5 years a consumption expenditure survey. Okay. That is the basis of our 2012 estimate of poverty that I was citing. The next one was done in 17-18, already 1 year too late. And then that was rejected by the government of India, saying, oh, no, this is not good enough. When in fact, that was showing that rural consumption had actually fallen by 8% compared to 11-12, and urban consumption had increased only by 2%. So that means poverty would have increased. What I've showed you based on the PLFS consumption expenditure service, that poverty was increasing pre-COVID, is now increasing even more. Okay, so look, if you don't have regular annual data, how will you, what's the notion of flow? Okay, I'll come to identifying in a minute, because your question is slightly deeper and I've understood the thrust of your question. Just to give you an international comparison. I travel to Latin American countries very regularly. I give lectures there. A book of mine is coming out in Spanish next month. And I know that they publish every year. Every year they have a statistic for poverty and for inequality. Every year. हम कब करते 5 साल में एक बार, और वो भी नहीं, उसको भी जो करा तो उसको रिजेक्ट कर दिया. अब बीच में अब कोविड आ गया, तो अब नेक्स्ट CES will probably be done, consumption expenditure survey will start in about a few months time. तो वो अगले साल के अंत में हमें डेटा मिलेगा. Good, you know. But let me turn to your stock flow notion of in respect of identifying the poor. What was I saying? You have to update your numbers. Whether a person is or a household has moved up out of poverty or deprivation or moved into it, at least 2 years. In a large country like that, perhaps you can't do it more often than that, but at least do it every 2 years. Or you haven't done it for 7, 8. Is this acceptable? Obviously not. So, you know, let me stop there, because on the COVID parameters, the new parameters post-COVID for poverty. Look, the most important parameter today post-COVID is health expenditure out of pocket. I'd be very surprised if health expenditure as a proportion, private health expenditure as a proportion of all expenditure has not risen. I think the NSO should, collect data about this. The last NSO survey on health showed that 70% of all expenditure on health is private or out of pocket. This is unacceptable in an extremely poor country. But this out of pocket expenditure is that high because the government doesn't spend. If the government doesn't spend, someone has to spend. No, the people spend, but they are impoverished as a result of that. And COVID has impoverished, I'm sure, hundreds of thousands of households because of out of pocket expenditure. मतलब जेब भी खाली हो गई या आदमी भी नहीं जब बचा. How long is this going to carry on? To me, this is the goriest dimension of the fact that public expenditure on health did not increase last year or this year. And the fact that for 3 years preceding COVID, health expenditure was stagnant. How are we going to achieve this government's own goal stated in the National Health Policy in 2017 that we need to more than double our health expenditure to GDP from 1.1% or so it was then, 3 years ago, to 2.5%. You know, China has been spending more than 2.5% of GDP on health, government health, for over 10 years, and their health outcome indicators are much superior to ours in any case. You know what rich countries spend? Government expenditure, I'm saying, 7 to 8% of GDP. What do we spend? 1.29% of GDP. Come on. Get serious. Now, I know that the health is a state subject, but, incentivize the states to spend more. Nah? Let the center spend more, even if this year it has to borrow to spend, because lives have to be saved in the 3rd wave, the 4th wave, because we still don't have enough vaccines to vaccinate people by the end of this year. When we are a manufacturer, 60% of the world's vaccines of all types are manufactured in India. We are a global manufacturing superpower, supposedly. And we become an importer of vaccines. Why? Isn't this a catastrophic policy failure?
Yeah, in the saga of passion that flew, you have left a number of questions unanswered, and we have we are going to definitely think and rethink on so many issues that you've talked about today. On behalf of our DG, Dr. G. Narendra Kumar, NIRDPR, who was called at the last moment by the ministry and couldn't be a part of this. And on behalf of our head of school, Professor Jyotish Satyapalan sir, on my personal behalf as head of the CDC, uh, on behalf of the Deputy Director General also, Srimati Radhika Rastogi, all faculty members of NIRDPR, staff of SIRD, and ETCs who've joined us. Sir, I am so humbled and grateful by the enriching articulation that you have just filled us with. It fills us with immense insight into so many things, and whatever that we can take forward to the ministry shall definitely be put forth by our efforts. Thank you for your precious time. It has been a memorable lectures. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Dhanyavad, dhanyavad.
Thank you,
Namaskar.
thank you. Thank you, Professor. It was really enlightening, and we really enjoyed this lecture you delivered. And I have a request, if we could, open the camera, everybody, and get a photograph, a group photograph for a memory, it will be nice. So I request all of you to switch on your camera to get a photograph. And I request Krishnaraj to take this photograph, Is it done?
Yes,
Well,
sir,
there are a lot
it's
of
done.
people who haven't turned their cameras on. Why
Yeah.
are they camera shy?
You need this. Sir, we
Yes,
will be in touch with you.
yes,
We need your support in future. It was really, educating and highly scholarly talk. Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's a pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This meeting is closed.
thank you all. Thank you for joining. Thank you. Thank you.